I have spent a fair chunk of time today reading graphic novels. And these are quite old graphic novels because they were written at the time and drawn at the time close to when Babylon 5 was a relatively young television series. Because, of course, these are Babylon 5 graphic novels. Jerry Michael Straczynski, who created the series, is also very well known for being a comic book writer. This may not be a familiar thing for many people to be aware of course, but he even, for example, appeared in the first Thor movie because he actually co-wrote, or I think out and out wrote, that movie. So he has a cameo on screen trying to pull Thor's hammer out of the ground early on in the film, which made me laugh because at the time I didn't actually know that was the case. I didn't know he had anything to do with the film. So I saw him on screen and I went, I'm sure that's J. Michael Straczynski. What's going on? So it was him. So Babylon 5 generally didn't get a huge amount of merchandise. I've got some videos on this channel that look at some of the limited amount that there was, like Micro Machines, some of the action figures that came out. But really, that was largely it. It wasn't a sort of a huge line. It could have been much bigger, really, but it didn't go that far. But what I've had for the longest time is these. And these books were published by Titan in the UK. And they reprint DC Comics and / Warner Brothers line of comics that came out at the time of the series, and also a little bit later on in the life of the series as well. But again, there weren't loads of them. I have about 12 issues worth here, and I think there were 14 altogether. So I'm missing 2, but they were never collected. And from what I can see on eBay, they are incredibly expensive to find. If I ever find them more cheaply, I might well try and source them and I'll come back. But I thought I'd give you a little overview of what's in, what arcs they cover, because they are canon. I think that's an important thing to note. These books are canon, unlike the novels, some of which are canon. All of these comics are canon. JMS didn't write all of them, but he did write some of them, and he gave the writers the premise for the other issues that he didn't cover. So they are canon. And although I've had these for ages, I think I've only actually sat down and read one of them before now, because the sort of the graphics in this one, the artistry in this one, isn't really my taste. So it may be that actually put me off reading it at the time. To give you an example, you see, the problem is that when you use CGI graphics in your show, and then you get sort of hand-drawn Star Furies that look like this, suspension of disbelief is a little bit harder. And I guess that's always the case when you're trying to do a comic that is based off a real life TV series. It's going to, the perception that you have in your head is going to differ to the one that you see represented in the comic. But this is a very interesting one because the overall arc in here is taking place around the end of season 1 through to the early part of season 2. That, I know that's a little bit vague, but I don't actually genuinely know exactly when this was supposed to happen. The first issue is called In Darkness Find Me. And basically this is where spoilers are going to start happening, so look away now, go to a different video if you haven't watched all of Babylon 5. Okay? Gone? Super. So, essentially, this arc covers the departure of Sinclair from the station at the end of season 1, and then what happens when he gets to Minbar, and actually then when he meets Delenn again briefly on Minbar, as he takes up his ambassadorial position there. And basically, it is a Home Guard story, and we hadn't heard a great deal about them outside of season 1. They start to get a little bit quieter after season 1, I think it's fair to say. I must admit, not having been watching the early series quite as recently as I was 2 years ago, I'm getting a little bit rusty on my titles and so on, but basically this is post-Chrysalis, and what puzzles me about it is that Garibaldi is running around, and I find that puzzling because I'm pretty sure that he didn't get recovered until a few episodes into season 2, nor indeed did Delenn come out of her chrysalis until a few episodes into season 2. So I'm not quite sure how long it takes for the events in this book to actually sort of fully kick in. I think it may be that Sinclair is actually on Earth and then travelling to Minbar, and that actually takes a period of weeks, perhaps, possibly. But again, it's always, without going back to the series, I'm not sure exactly how much time passed in real time for these events to have happened, for everybody to be sort of back. But it is quite interesting because we see that Sinclair does get in touch with Michael to apologise for having left before he regained consciousness. And it basically involves Sinclair being framed for a potential assassination attempt on the new Minbari leader. And I was racking my brains because I can't think that we ever actually have the new Minbari leader named that early in season 2, because at one point Delenn was offered the position which she declined, but I'm not sure that we then found out who it actually was for the duration of the series. So I don't think they were actually named here. They do appear in this comic towards the end, but I don't actually know if they were named. I just turned to this page. This made me chuckle because here Sinclair gives Delenn a little kiss goodbye when she's going back to the station. He's staying on Minbar, so I thought the netizens of the Grey 17 podcast would probably laugh at that because they're absolutely convinced at this point in time that Sinclair and Delenn are in fact married, which of course they really aren't. But anyway, we'll skip over that. But that was funny in that context because that does suggest there was going to be potentially something more between them, which of course never came to pass. But Psycho is also involved in this particular storyline. And interestingly, I mentioned that this was published by Titan in the UK. I got very excited the other night when I discovered that there was another graphic novel which I did not own. I thought I had all of them. It turns out I didn't, because in the States there was this, Babylon 5, The Price of Peace. And ironically, this is actually exactly the same, although it's a better quality of print, but it's exactly the same as the first Titan book that I just showed you here. However, it does have issue 11 of the Babylon 5 comic run, which is the Psycho and You. And this was not reprinted in the UK version of the book. So this is an extra for me, which I had not seen before. Although, for some reason, I think I've seen an excerpt from it maybe in another magazine, because some of the frames in it were familiar to me. But I don't know exactly maybe from the Babylon 5 magazine, that was the official magazine for the show. But this is quite interesting because it shows features Bester and a sort of an unknown commercial telepath. So it's one that you'd only otherwise be able to find in a single issue in this country, because again, it wasn't part of our collected works, but it is otherwise exactly the same 4 issues, the first 4 issues of the Babylon 5 comic, as per the sort of unlabeled Babylon 5 book that was published by Titan. One thing I'm going to do for you, which I wouldn't normally do, but there is a really nice introductory text here from JMS, and this was written in, I can barely read that. I'll tell you what, old age is no fun, folks. July 1998, I think it was July 1998, which is probably about right. The book is copyright 1998, so that makes sense. So I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's it's a nice sort of capture of his interest in comics. I love comics. I say that unreservedly, unabashedly, proudly. As a kid, it bounced from one school to the next, always one step behind the latest tectonic shift in curricula. Comics taught me how to read. They also taught me math. When I started out, 10 comics cost $1 even. Then the cost went to 12 cents, and I had to rebudget what little money I had to ensure that the steady flow of X number of comics per week remained the same, even when they went to 15 cents later. Comics showed me strange, distant worlds, introduced me to people who were just like me, but through chance, fate, lantern, or jetpack, were given the opportunity to make a difference. They injected me with the best vaccine any 12-year-old can ever receive, a sense of wonder. Mainly, though, they taught me about heroes. And when I grew up and became a writer, I decided that among many other things, I would write about strange, distant worlds and people touched by chance or fate who became more than they thought possible. I would write about heroes, also bad guys, grey guys, civilians, aliens, and great ships that scream in your mind as they fly past. But mainly, I would write about heroes. Which was why it was important to me that there should be Babylon 5 comics. To reach the next 12-year-old learning to read and pass along the virus of wonder, to remind the 24-year-old what it was like to be that 12-year-old, to explore the rest of the Babylon 5 universe and tell stories that would be impossible on a television budget. It seemed right and proper to me that what began with comics should circle back to them again. Some of that first run succeeded, some failed. The reasons do not bear rehashing. They happened, it's over, and a new run of Babylon 5 stories designed to be what they were always intended to be hit the stores and took off, as I always believed they would given the chance. Who knows, there may even be more to come down the road a piece. Meanwhile, presented for your attention some of the diamonds rescued from the gravel. They are particularly noteworthy because this is the first time events in a comic have been considered canonical and used to flesh out events from the series that birthed it, events that were eventually reflected in and incorporated back into the series itself. Complementary stories running on parallel tracks between television and comics, the marriage that was always waiting to happen if given the opportunity. These were the first, they will not be the last. So there you have it, you see. And that's very, very true because there are definitely elements that appear in these first 4 issues that you do see referred to again and that do establish certain things and refer back to certain things that have already happened, like Talia watching Duck Dodgers with Garibaldi as he's recuperating. Just little touches. If you're into the series, you'll completely get it. And the intro is basically straight from Midnight on the Firing Line. So it's kind of, straight from the Battle of the Line. You know, when we see those flashback sequences, that is what the comics open with. So it's really, really interesting to see that sort of captured. And as I say, for some reason, I can't say that I've ever actually sat down and properly watched that. Now, read it even, you know. Sorry, I'm doing this far too late in the evening, I do apologise. So issues 5 to 8, and I had to correct the fandom wiki on this, because the fandom wiki said this only contains 6 and 7, but it contains 5, 6, 7 and 8. I have checked, that's what it says on the inside cover, and it's definitely 4 stories. This one's quite an interesting one, because this contains 2 stories, effectively, running in parallel to each other. So, long story short, Garibaldi is suspicious of communications that Londo has been happening, and he wants to go and check where he's meeting someone in space. But Morden tells Londo to go and visit a colony instead and asks for the rendezvous point so that he and his associates can meet Mr. Garibaldi, and as it turns out, Keffer as well, in space. So, as a result of that sequence of events, a shadow fighter engages the interatmospheric shuttle that Garibaldi and Keffer are on force it down, and then a sort of a race ensues to try and get to a nearby Centauri colony before they get clobbered by what interestingly turned out to be telepathic shadow agents, which I found quite interesting because I wouldn't have thought that the shadows would want to use telepathic agents, but apparently they were, at least to some extent. So interesting. But off the back of those events, what we also see is a much, much earlier period of time when Garibaldi first met Sinclair. And that's a really interesting sequence of events because it takes place on Mars. Garibaldi is drinking, so he's not in a great shape when Sinclair first meets him, so it's not a great first impression. And they have an adventure because Sinclair and a couple of other officers who are quite young are looking into reports that some sort of alien and Earth contact is happening clandestinely on Mars. So they're running around in Garibaldi's shuttle, sort of finding false flight plans and trying to find out what's going on. And of course, what it turns out that it's actually the events from Messages from Earth in season 3 that is what's happening. So we see this tied back into in the series because during that episode, Garibaldi produces a Psychor badge, a badly burnt Psychor badge, but a Psychor badge. And that Psychor badge is also in this comic and is his hard proof that the Psychor were involved with a shadow vessel that was digging out another shadow vessel on Mars. And from the looks of the comic, that they were also engineering people in this facility to be placed into shadow vessels. And that's not something that we find out from the TV episode, but it does seem to be canon per this book. There's even a frame in here where we see that Talia could have been involved in that chain of events as well. Not that we ever hear anything about that again afterwards, but there is that suggestion in the comic that maybe she would have been had Garibaldi and Sinclair not intervened in events. So it's a really, really interesting sort of tie-in, and it does very clearly highlight just how far Garibaldi had fallen and the difficulties that he was facing based on his previous time on Mars. And we have heard in the series as well details of just how badly he messed up in Mars. That is very much established as part of his backstory in the show itself, notwithstanding what's in this comic. So again, really interesting. So maybe the most interesting one comes with this, which is quite a late published comic series, because this basically continues the story of Valen in a way which the series would never have been able to do, because it only focuses on Sinclair as Valen, although it does also deal with Babylon 4. I've just finished reading this one. Again, this is a Titan Books publication. This was again released in 1998. So you can immediately see from this that it's much, the graphics are much improved. It's a very different sort of style of drawing in this one. And this is, the first issue was written by JMS, and the remaining issues were written by one Peter David, who will be very familiar to many of you, I'm sure, because he is known as a prolific writer of both Babylon 5 episodes, well, actually only 2, but more prolific writer of Star Trek novels and so on. So, he's a very experienced science fiction writer, and this story revolves around the rediscovery of Babylon 4. So just think about that for a moment. Think Babylon Squared, think War Without End. What happened to Babylon 4 after it went back? This is the answer to that question. And basically, it's still around. It's pretty wrecked, but it is still around because unlike the other Babylon stations, Babylon 4 was mobile. It had engines, intentionally, so that it could get itself out of trouble if need be. And what's happened is that it's been moved away from its original location to a resting place, and then just sort of abandoned. And so Delenn spends quite a lot of the issues looking at records left by Valen as to how the Shadow War was fought 1,000 years ago and what various people went through. And they also discovered that there was another race that was acting in support who they had a falling out with, and they have recently started trying to scavenge the station. This is why a signal has been triggered that drew them to the station in the first place. So there are shenanigans involving trying to get off the station before it falls into the atmosphere of the planet it's orbiting. But in the meantime, Delenn is going through all these sort of records, and very, very intriguingly, and this is where it will fit into the novels, which I haven't got round to reading all of yet. I'm just into the first one. It's not great, but I'm going to try and stick with it to give you an idea of what they're like. But the last thing that Valen says that Delenn is able to recover is that I found her. And I know what that means. You will probably know what that means. But if you don't know what it means, ask me in the comments and I'll let you know. Now, the other thing that I thought I was getting very excited about was that the fandom page said that in the Lost Files, there was another mini comic. And I thought, no way. I thought, I've never seen a mini comic inside here. But then I got even more excited when I saw there was indeed a sealed package of something inside the Lost Files DVD. I thought, brilliant, it's the comic. It wasn't the comic, of course. Turns out when I actually delved into it, what I had was what I always thought I had, which was postcards. So you get these quite nice little postcards. Not that they've actually put anything on that you can put an address on, but you have these postcards. Just those four. So they're not mint and sealed anymore, they're just mint. It turned out, basically, long story short, that you only got this mini comic in a US version, and even then only in a few of the US versions of The Lost Tales. And apparently it actually addressed Franklin and Jakar travelling beyond the rim in a ship that Franklin bought. That's about as much as I know, basically. I don't know if there is any more to know than that, but I think it was a nod of the head to the characters, because obviously, sadly, the actors had passed away at that point. So that only leaves, as I mentioned earlier, 2 other issues which I have not seen. But it's really interesting because, like the novels, I suppose, although the novels are not as canon heavy in some respects as these comics are, given that all the comics are canon. But they've expanded on the sort of question of what the heck happened to Sinclair after the end of season 1, because we just don't get told anything about what happened to sort of transition him to the ambassadorial role. And there are, most of you will be familiar with the real world reasons behind that, I think. But then we also get this interesting sort of look back at Sinclair and Garibaldi with hair on Mars, much earlier than we've seen before, but which also ties into a current episode or a more current episode within the normal timeline of the 5-year arc. So that's very clever as well, because again, it's doing something they couldn't otherwise have done realistically, in detail in an episode. They couldn't have done a full flashback. It just wouldn't have been feasible. And then we also get this nice callback to Babylon 4 and the timeline. And there is a very interesting argument, although we don't actually hear anything about it. There is an argument between Sinclair and one of the Vorlons, which could be Kosh, the original Kosh, about whether he should do a sort of a Back to the Future and kind of give the Minbari a warning about the incident that triggers the Earth-Minbari War. But then he reasons it out, as the Vorlons would have said to him as well, that he's got to accept that he is locked into this closed circle, because if the war doesn't happen, there are no Babylon stations. If there are no Babylon stations, there's no Babylon 4. If there's no Babylon 4, the Shadows win the Shadow War from 1,000 years ago, and we lose, basically, badly. So, covers a lot of really sort of interesting topics like that. And as JMS said in his foreword, you just wouldn't be able to do it on a TV show's budget. So it gave him the opportunity to leverage another tool at his disposal, already being a comic book writer, to expand his universe. And this is one of the sad things about Warner Brothers just not ever having sort of really run with the series again after it finished, because there was such scope for doing things like that. And if you think back to the original Star Trek series, that show was kept alive in no small part, I think, due to the number of novels that kept on being produced for it in the gap between the series ending and the first film coming along. And that sort of expanded universe is so common these days, and spin-offs and everything else are so common. And obviously Babylon 5 did get a spin-off. It just never quite got the traction to really keep going and really keep expanding the universe. I mean, I've just watched the first 3 episodes of Star Trek Picard, and that's a wonderful thing to see, because they've been so lucky that they've still got all of the sort of pretty much all of the original cast still available to them, which sadly Babylon 5 doesn't have. But to see that being sort of brought back is really, really lovely. And it's a strange thing, because you couldn't really do it with Babylon 5 in the sense that Babylon 5 had a very distinct built-in arc that was its story, but it is a big universe, so you could do other things that maybe wouldn't be Babylon 5, kind of, in much the same way that Crusade wasn't Babylon 5, but we did see Babylon 5 in it. So you could do that, and obviously, JMS clearly has something in mind for the reboot concept. But what you could do these days, of course, with these sorts of books and everything else, and you could build all that in right from the get-go and have it all sort of timed and ready to happen, and the possibilities would be limitless at this point in where we are in the world timeline, so to speak. So I'm glad I've been able to sort of give you some background there. I mean, these books are still available on eBay. They might even still be available on Amazon if you're very, very lucky. I mean, they're probably long since out of print, of course, but thrift stores will probably carry them as well. As I discovered, I was able to source all the Babylon 5 novels pretty rapidly with not too much searching required. So just look around, I mean, eBay, as I've been discovering over the last few months, is the font of all things ancient. So if you do need something from your childhood, the odds are eBay will still sell it in some way, shape or form. So I say, if you've got any questions about these books and what happens in them, let me know in the comments, and I will try and inform you. I wanted to sort of do these on the day that I'd read through them all, because otherwise I'll start losing details pretty rapidly, knowing me. But I can fish them out again to let you know what's what. I think that was what I wanted to cover. I'm still planning to do reviews of Crusade and Legend of the Rangers, and sort of all that sort of good stuff that I haven't done yet, just to round things off. But if you haven't really checked it out, do check out things like the Grey 17 podcast that's out and current at the moment. Really clever idea, really nicely done, nice group of people doing it. Really interesting to see what newcomers to the show say about it today, and to hear stuff that maybe you hadn't even considered before. I've heard some really sort of interesting concepts that I think even the first ones, the oldies who are watching the show with the newbies, perhaps hadn't thought of in their run through of it, because we're in a different time now, and they have different perspectives on it and how acceptable certain things are in it and everything else that maybe were different to when we were watching it back in the 90s. So lots of other podcasts are very active as well. So it's well worth having a little sort of nose around if you're thinking about revisiting the series at all, really. So that's it for me for now, before my voice runs out. So thank you for watching. Do like and subscribe as ever, and I will see you again. Cheers for now.